Well, welcome. And I actually don't know where Nicole was, but this is the agenda for tonight. Welcome. Where was she? I don't know. I don't think we have much for housekeeping. We will have a survey at the end. We'll send that out. That'll be good for both the prize entry as well as the speaker rating. We really like to get both of those things in, so we'll make sure that link is available in the comments. If it's not there now, we'll be posting it shortly. But it's typical, we always have some prizes, and it's kind of like a trade-off, a rating and comment for a entry into a prize. So that's a win-win. Okay, we've got our YouTube channel up here. We will be monitoring Zoom throughout the evening. So if you have questions, feel free to post your questions either on Zoom or YouTube. Keep in mind that YouTube runs a little bit behind the Zoom presentation. So if you want a quick answer, Zoom is a better way to get your question in. If you post on YouTube, by the time the question comes in and there's going to be a delay. We may not get to it as quickly, but we'll still be watching those. So yeah, just there's that. And okay, I am jumping around all like crazy here. I think there's a delay in when I press the button and the slides it's showing, so I apologize about that. We do want to thank our sponsors tonight. The sponsors help keep this going. In a COVID situation or in a non-COVID situation, they're providing the location and food, but they're also providing the prizes and whatnot. So we thank our sponsors for helping us keep this going. And now it's my opportunity to introduce Matthew. Matthew is joining us from Mississippi tonight, which is awesome to be able to have a virtual session so that we can get Matthew as a speaker. And he's going to be talking to us about managed identities and PostgreSQL. And my first question for Matthew, before we even start the presentation, I want to know how to pronounce it, because I've heard multiple pronunciations and I want to know how to pronounce Postgre. So with that, Matthew, the floor is yours.
Oh, I just call it Postgres, you know.
Some people leave off the S, it's Postgre, and I don't know if it's French or something, but
I think they're just trying to be extra, honestly, but you know. But yeah, I've called it Postgres ever since I've known it was a database. So, you know, potato, potato. All right, give me a second to figure out how to share my slides, and I will get started. All right, can everybody see that? All right.
Yeah.
I'm going to apologize up front. I focus more on the content and less on, you know, the aesthetics. So, you know, you'll notice right up there in the upper right-hand corner, you see presentation title. I did not know how to remove that from this template, so you're going to see that the rest of the presentation. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Matthew Gray, and tonight I'm going to talk about Azure Active Directory, managed identities, and PostgreSQL. And there we go. So, you know, first off, in terms of Active Directory or Azure Active Directory, you know, it's very handy in the sense that you can manage all of your users, groups, managed identities, et cetera, and so forth in a central location. You can manage the access policies for all of those. And where that relates to PostgreSQL, at least in the context of Azure, is, you know, one of the things as we're moving to the cloud, one of the things we're really concerned about is security. Postgres as a database is a fairly robust relational database management system. But as you know, as is the case with any sort of data store, particularly anything hosted in the cloud, we're concerned about people getting access to it. More particularly, we're concerned about preventing preventing access to malicious party or access by malicious parties rather. So, how do we go about preventing that? Well, one of the ways we go about closing that potential threat vector is by using rotating credentials or credentialless authentication. And so, in particular, I'm going to speak about that. And while we can provide that for actual Active Directory users and members of Active Directory users that are members of Active Directory groups, I'm going to speak particularly to the steps necessary to set up an Azure Postgres instance to allow Active Directory access by managed identity. Why managed identity? What is a managed identity, right? So in the context of this, a managed identity would be an identity we can assign to a resource that we expect to have access to this Postgres database. In this presentation, I'm going to speak particularly to a virtual machine that has a managed identity associated with it, but this could be other kinds of resources in the cloud, like let's say a pod in a Kubernetes cluster hosted by Azure AKS, right? So, to summarize, using a managed identity to access a relational database like Postgres or even Microsoft SQL allows us to provide a credentialless authentication path for that resource to access that database. And so, what steps do we need to go through to do this, right? And from a high level, first of all, we need to go ahead and create all of our users, groups, identities that we expect to have access to the database. In particular, we want to make sure we define an AD administrator user or group, right? So, and that becomes important in the next step, where we have to explicitly assign that AD administrator user or group to the Postgres instance that exists in Azure. By the way, I'm skipping a step here. I'm assuming that we already have a Postgres instance in Azure stood up to do this with. So anyways, after we've assigned an AD administrator to the Postgres instance, then we need to create the database users in the database, or I'm sorry, the database roles at the database level for the users and identities that we've set up in Active Directory. And then after we've associated those Active Directory identities with roles in the database, we can then obtain an an Active Directory token rather, for these users and identities, and use that Active Directory token to authenticate into the Postgres database. And so, the first part of that is I started talking about identities and focused in a little bit on, having an Active Directory admin, right? Well, the reason why that's important is in the Azure hosted PostgreSQL instances, you cannot create Active Directory users and roles at the database level without having logged in as an Active Directory administrator of that PostgreSQL database, right? So the first thing you've got to do is create that user or group. Typically, the best practice is to use a group that represents your DBAs, and the members of that group will be able to log in using Azure Active Directory as an Azure Active Directory admin to the PostgreSQL database, right? Once they've logged into that database, they can go in and create the appropriate roles and assign the appropriate database level permissions to those roles to Active Directory users, groups, and managed identities based on their client ID. And we're going to look specifically at some of the steps in doing that. And first off, assuming that you have a PostgreSQL instance stood up in Azure. The instance we're looking at here is one I've got in my own Azure account, and it's a single server instance. But whether it's a single server instance or a clustered PostgreSQL resource in Azure, the mechanism is the same for setting an Active Directory admin. There's a Active Directory admin blade in the Azure portal view of that PostgreSQL server. And it is at this page where you set the admin and set the actual admin name of the Postgres login, right? And that can be different from the actual Active Directory group or username that you assign, right? And that's important because we need to know what this explicit username we set for the Active Directory admin is when we go to log into the PostgreSQL database. And so, after we've logged in using the Azure command line tool, using probably AZ login or some other mechanism, we execute this command. And what this command is actually doing is we're using our Azure account to fetch a access token, an Active Directory access token, against an open source relational database management system resource type, which is what this, my apologies, what this OSS RDBMS resource type represents. And so the PostgreSQL instance in Azure is represented as an OSS RDBMS resource type. And we're fetching that access token. So with this particular command, we will get out what is essentially a JWT token, a JWT token. And you can actually decode that at jwt.io or some other base64 decoding utility. But it's essentially just an access token that we will then use in the next step to log in on the command line using the PostgreSQL command line client. Now, it's important to note that the username that's defined for the SQL admin is the same username that we use when we log in. And that's a little confusing because, initially, unless you've done this a million times and know better, your first inclination is to actually use the username of the Active Directory account you're logging in as, and that doesn't work. It's already got, it's already using your Active Directory user account when you get the AD token, and that's embedded in the base64 encoding of that token. So all the information about who you are and what rights or accesses you may or may not have according to Active Directory are embedded in this token, right? So when you log in with that admin name that's defined whenever you assign your Azure Directory identity to the AD admin for the PostgreSQL server, you pass as the password the token we got in the previous step. After we've logged in as the Active Directory admin for the PostgreSQL database, then we can go ahead and create roles for different Azure Active Directory identities, right? So we can create a role. And so in this case, we'll create a role named ID user. You can name it whatever you want, right, for that role, but you need to remember what that name is, because just like with the username that we had to use for the SQL admin when we logged in previously, whatever you name this role is the name you're going to have to use to log in as that user, right? So we'll create a role, ID user, with login password, and you set the password to be the managed identity client ID or the Active Directory user client ID or Active Directory group client ID. And you add it to the PostgreSQL database role, Azure AD user. Now, this exists in Azure PostgreSQL instances as a special kind of role. And any users you add to this role, it's going to attempt to authenticate or authorize your JOT token that you pass as a password against Azure Active Directory. And so once you've created that role, you then can turn around and grant privileges on resources within the database to that role. In this particular case, we're granting the privileges on all the tables in a particular database, but you can get very granular with that. And I'll leave that to a DBA to figure out. But in this case, I'm just opening the permissions wide open for the database MyDB. And I mentioned the managed identity client ID. Well, if we look at the Azure portal view for an Azure managed identity, and this is an example of one, the client ID that you pass as the password in that previous step is this right here, not to be confused with the object ID. Now that we've used the Azure AD admin identity for the PostgreSQL database, our next step is to go ahead and take some of these Azure identities that we've configured roles and permissions for and log in with them, right? Well, specifically speaking to a managed identity, you can't just do that from your machine. You're logged in as an actual user and you're a member of a group. The managed identity has to be assigned to a resource, right? Like a VM or an AKS cluster. So, realize that these steps that I'm about to talk in a little bit more detail about, they're running in the context of a process on a virtual machine, right? That already has a managed identity assigned to it. And there are 4 steps here. Here with this diagram, you see that we've got to first log in, fetch the access token, connect using the token, and the PostgreSQL server will validate that token against Azure Active Directory. Now, this probably already sounds familiar because we just did the same thing with the admin identity that is set up for that PostgreSQL server. The process is exactly the same. The only difference is the account we're about to log in with, or managed identity we're about to log in with, does not have admin rights, or may not have admin rights. I guess technically you could take the admin AD role and grant admin rights to every identity, but that's, if you're doing that, then maybe it's not for a production system, I don't guess. And so on a VM configured with a managed identity or in a Kubernetes pod, we would be able to simply call AZ login identity, assuming whatever process we're running is in a script. This also can be performed in using particular libraries in .NET Core, C#. But for the purpose of simplicity, we're just going to assume everything's being done from like a bash script or a PowerShell script. And so we can call AZ login identity to fetch a token representing the managed identity associated with this machine. If we wanted to fetch a token for a specific managed identity associated with this machine, in case there's more than one, you can use the -u argument and you can specify the resource ID from Azure for that managed identity. And then, just like in our previous step, we log in using the PostgreSQL command line client. And you see here, my username, instead of SQL admin, is the ID user that we defined for the particular role in PostgreSQL while we were logged in as the SQL admin user, right? Other than that, the rest of the behavior is the same. We pass it the token that we got when we called AZ login identity. And at that point, PostgreSQL will then validate that token against Azure Active Directory and then allow you to log in.